Plants are incredible because they're autotrophic, which means they can produce their own food in a process called photosynthesis. During photosynthesis, plants take on sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide to produce oxygen and sugar. Plant cells contain millions of tiny organelles known as chloroplasts, where photosynthesis occurs. Within each chloroplast, there are tiny pancake-shaped structures known as thylakoid, which arrange themselves in stacks known as granum. You can think of the thylakoid as being like tiny solar panels that help absorb sunlight in this process of photosynthesis. On the other hand, you have the stroma, which is a fluid-filled region that fills the gaps in between the thylakoids. It's here in the stroma where the dark reactions, or the Calvin cycle, occurs. It's called the dark reactions because no sunlight is needed for this process. If you understand why plants are green, it can give you a better understanding of photosynthesis. The reason why plants appear green is because it absorbs all wavelengths of light except for green. Plants tend to absorb red and blue wavelengths really well. Green gets reflected back into your eyes, and that's why you perceive plants as being green. The three primary colors of light are red, green, and blue. So again, an object that appears red is because it's reflecting red wavelengths of light. Something that looks blue is because it's reflecting blue, and a plant or a leaf appears green because it's reflecting the color green. You can mix your primary colors to create secondary colors. So if you mix red and green, you get yellow. If you mix green and blue, you will get cyan. And if you mix red and blue, you get magenta. So those are the three secondary colors. If you mix the three primary colors, red, green, and blue, you will get white. And if you tone down all the colors, you get black. So black is the absence of light, or the absorbance of all light. That's why your brain perceives it as black. Two types of green pigment, known as chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, are found in the chloroplasts. These two pigments together absorb red and blue wavelengths of light extremely well. However, chlorophyll has a very difficult time absorbing green, which is why the graph plummets around 500 to 600 nanometers, which is the wavelength of green light. Plants change colors in the fall. They go from green to red, orange, and yellow because the green chlorophyll pigment starts to die off. It's as if the plants detect less and less sunlight during the day, so as a result, they realize they don't need to perform as much photosynthesis as before. Photosynthesis produces food for themselves, so it's almost like the plants are going into hibernation mode. There are two stages of photosynthesis. You have the light reactions and the dark reactions. The dark reactions are also known as the Calvin cycle, so we'll get to that later. But just understand sunlight and water enter the light reactions, and the light reactions occurs inside the thylakoids, which are the pancake-shaped structures that we discussed earlier. That's why it's been labeled with the number 1. Now, water gets stripped down, and its electrons are carried by a molecule called NADPH. Okay? And as it gets stripped down, ADP becomes ATP. So these are like energy currencies that help power the Calvin cycle. Now, do understand oxygen is also released as a byproduct. So plants produce oxygen for animals to breathe in. Now, ATP and NADPH, which is carrying electrons, help change the CO2, the carbon dioxide that enters the dark reactions, into sugar. So the dark reactions are also known as the Calvin cycle. It's called dark reactions because this occurs without sunlight and it occurs inside the stroma. So once your ATP and your NADPH has been spent, they get spit out again. Okay, and they get spit out as ADP and NADP+, which then re-enter the light reactions, and the cycle continues. So water gets stripped down, ATP and NADPH then power the Calvin cycle, and it helps change the CO2 into sugar, and the cycle just repeats. Sometimes it's important to know the minor details when you're studying something like photosynthesis. So you saw how in the previous diagram I mentioned ATP helps power the Calvin cycle or the dark reactions. ATP is a form of energy currency, and it stands for adenosine triphosphate. Triphosphate because it has 3 phosphate groups. So you can think of ATP as being a stick of dynamite, and when the cells are ready to use it, they'll crack that dynamite open and it releases energy. Well, when the ATP gets used up, when its energy gets spent, it then becomes ADP, which stands for adenosine diphosphate, because one of the phosphate groups got ripped off. Now you have two phosphates, which is why it's called adenosine diphosphate. So let's just take one close look at this. You have ATP, which enters the Calvin cycle, and it helps change carbon dioxide into sugar, like how we discussed earlier. When the ATP gets spent, it becomes ADP, which then re-enters the light reactions. It gets rephosphorylated, it becomes ATP again, and the cycle continues. So to give you a summary of photosynthesis, carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight enter the chloroplast, where they're changed into glucose and oxygen. You're going to see in my next video on cell respiration how it's the exact opposite of photosynthesis. So animal cells will use glucose and oxygen to produce chemical energy, and in the process of doing so, they'll release water and carbon dioxide. The products of photosynthesis are the reactants of cell respiration. There's a symbiosis between plants and animals. We both depend on each other to survive. It's an incredible relationship, and it's really important in understanding biology. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time on Win Biology.